Oh, jeez.
Okay, well, I sent a list of things we might talk about. I'll just read through it, and I'm sure we'll find something to dive into. Where was it? One was
I see it here, yep.
Vitalik Buterin's DAC, which I don't remember whether we talked about it or not, but maybe it was very briefly. I think we had time to talk about Gemini a few weeks ago. So that's one. Transhumanism in general, that's sort of a big part of Buterin's post in some implicit way. The culture novels. I reread Player of Games about a month ago, which I quite liked. I'm rereading or trying to reread Accession at the moment, which is, if you remember that one, that's about some ancient, highly advanced technology appearing around some star and everybody racing to investigate and or take advantage of it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Yeah, I remember that one.
I find it very tedious.
I quite like that one.
Okay, good.
I should say, I quite liked some. There was one subplot that I found very tedious. One subplot that I found not so awesome, and then because he Banks frequently breaks up the stories into several parallel plot lines, and I could have done without probably half the book.
That's what I was about to say.
But I did really enjoy the ones that were about the minds, the AIs and what they were thinking.
Oh, that's funny.
The rest of it I could take it or leave it.
Yeah, that was. I was about to say exactly that. I'm skipping all the chapters with humans in them, which I think is a pretty interesting comment.
Yeah,
because obviously it's just like theatre or something. It's hardly it's sort of irrelevant. Which is maybe a comment on the culture itself. We could talk a bit about.
If you haven't read it, you might. Unlike many sci-fi authors, Banks wrote quite a long and thoughtful piece about the setting of the culture books.
Really?
I think it's called Thoughts on the Culture or Notes on the Culture or something like that. And it's quite a long and very thoughtful essay, and that is definitely worth reading. Because I read that. It's probably the most recent thing of his that I've read. I haven't read one of the novels for several years, but I think within the last 12 or 18 months I've read that essay, which was really helpful. It shed a lot of light on his thinking about the setting and the assumptions that he was making, and in good spirit too. He doesn't take himself too seriously, I think, and it was very helpful to me. So I would definitely recommend reading that. It gave me a lot to chew on and cast his novels in a new light for me at any rate. So
yeah, he's Scottish, right? I seem to remember that. Maybe.
Yes, I think he was. Unfortunately, he passed away, so he's not with us, and we won't be getting any more of the novels. And he was quite adamantly. Unfortunately, when I found out that he passed away, one of the immediate thing I did was try to find out whether or not he was planning on having anybody else authorized to continue writing books in that setting. And unfortunately, he was quite adamantly opposed against that. He had a very strong negative opinion to somebody else using his fictional universe. So I guess we won't be seeing more of that outside of fan fiction.
Another topic is GPTs, plural, that being a sort of new packaging system for collection of prompts and plugins and files that OpenAI has been pushing, in which I've made several GPTs for Russell's homeschooling. We could talk a bit about that and sort of broader predictions for how this market and technology is going to develop in 2024. I'd also like to get some updates from you, Adam, on precision fermentation and some of the other disruptions you're tracking, since we haven't really talked about that for a while. So I think that's more than enough for an hour and a half. Maybe we can start by just continuing to chat a little bit about the culture and then segue into techno-optimism by Buterin. How does that sound?
Sure, that sounds great.
Yeah, Ben, do you know anything about the culture novels? Have you read any of them?
I haven't actually. I'm currently studying The Expanse as my new sci-fi series,
good,
which I heard is really good. Because I finished the TV show and got frustrated, just stopped. So I'm going back and reading it all. But no, I haven't read the books.
Okay. So the culture is set. I think it's meant to be on the order of 10,000 years or so in the future. Is that about right, Adam?
I think that it does share the Milky Way galaxy with the Earth, but it isn't a human-centric universe. So it isn't I think technically it is in our future, but humanity's not part of it. I think there was a short story that was set on the Earth. I think before the modern day, like 1970s or something like that.
What do you mean humans aren't part of it? I mean, there's certainly humans.
It's a humanoid future, but they are not descendants of humans from planet Earth. They are. Banks is cryptic about that. Again, if you read in the notes of the culture, he explains that, and he says, no, it's not. The galaxy is not populated by humans and human descendants. It's a very full and very old place with lots and lots of civilizations that have risen and fallen, and the culture is sort of a middling, quite long-lived, but not the longest-lived one that just happens to be around at this time.
Okay,
and humanity's in there, but humanity's not. It's not. This is not humanity's future. It actually is running parallel to that. So
in that sense. But I mean, clearly, most of the protagonists are meant to be thought of as human and more or less have human physiology and so on, whether or not it's a bit like Star Wars, right? Like, it's like not technically.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly like that. Yeah, like they all just happen to be humanoid.
Yeah. Okay. So it's it's very advanced technology that most of the galaxy, at least the part of it that is sort of occupied by the culture, which is presented as a very kind of, I wouldn't say democratic. How would you describe the political system exactly? It's meant to be kind of. Yeah, I don't even really know. It's basically techno-anarchism.
It's basically, it's like techno-anarchism, but with an underlying sort of luxury automated communism kind of or socialism kind of element to it, because you have two completely distinct layers of if you want to use air quotes, society. There's sort of the humanoid and human and slightly modified, slightly transhumanist, but broadly speaking, human and human level intelligences. And then at a very different level, you have these AI, godlike, incredibly capable AI. And those AI are the true governing authorities. Like that, I mean, they're the puppet masters. They're controlling everything. They set all the terms, but the humans exist amidst basically by choice amidst prosperity, and there aren't any rules. This is one of the things that it's very strange and very genuinely alien about the culture's setting, is that there is no government, there's no enforcement, there's no policing, there's no nothing. You can basically do whatever you want, and people don't, because there's no involuntary suffering or involuntary hardship, and because of that, there's no shortage of space and no shortage of resources. There's no shortage of anything, and so as a result, people just do whatever they want, and where there are disagreements, if they become violent, then the minds can get involved. This AI layer can get involved, like parents controlling their children and keeping their children from fighting. So it's a little strange. It's hard to say exactly. At the human level, it's pretty anarchic, but obviously amidst material and energy superabundance. But then at this higher level of organization, it's entirely authoritarian, but sort of an egalitarian, you can think of it as a large committee where each of the committee members is broadly equal, and they are this like the ruling party basically.
Okay, so like the average citizen hasn't got like a vote or anything. It's very
I think that there are circumstances where the citizens can vote on certain things, but they're mostly matters of taste. Yeah. They aren't laws per se, and that kind of thing.
And the impression you get is that on any issue that actually matters, like military questions or sort of state policy, whatever that would mean, galactic state policy, the decision-making capability of humans is basically viewed with sneering contempt by the capital M minds that actually run things, and it's sort of basically treated as ridiculous, the idea that the humans would be anything other than pawns when it comes to decisions that really matter. And indeed in Accession, which is treating like one of the I mean, obviously, to create drama, there have to be stakes, and the stakes generally happen either on the periphery of the culture, as in the player of games, where it's sort of a question of influencing some less advanced civilization to do what the culture wants in one way or another, and that creates like personal stakes for some of the meatbags, humans involved. But for issues that are sort of actually important and potentially threatening to the culture, basically like in Accession, you just have minds, and in fact like a subset of minds, and it's sort of like an interesting conspiracy. Even within the mind, some are treated as basically dummies. But like the idea that humans would be involved in that in any way other than just like instrumental tools is basically like just off the table. Which is yeah.
Sorry, I was gonna say I don't want to get too developed by you just explaining the book to me. But is an international like war thing going on, or is it more like all society is a bit more harmonious throughout the galaxy?
It's very it's very harmonious. There's not a whole lot of conflict. Conflict is pretty rare.
Okay.
Within the culture itself, and its boundaries are quite porous at the edges, but within the culture itself, there's very little violent conflict.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's
like
some
Star Wars or Firefly.
Yeah. So there's some kind of secession where parts of the culture split off and do other things, and this is, I mean, I don't, at least in the books I've read, there's no kind of civil war associated to that. It's pretty loose, except, I mean, there is, you see glimpses of a much more hardline aspect to the culture when it comes to technology sharing with races that are deemed like outside of the culture, that are deemed like socially unacceptable, basically, in terms of their attitudes to other living things. There's a very like strong hegemonic American liberalism sort of baked into the framework. Maybe you would disagree, Adam, but like the cultures that are, I mean, there's in the player of games basically a whole sort of civilization sort of spanning several star systems is threatened with basically military takeover by the culture for basically just being bad, and this threat, while not directly executed, sort of leads to the collapse of the ruling elite. So the culture's not afraid to throw its weight around when it encounters civilizations that it deems like to be in bad taste or something. Yeah. So
okay, cool.
Yeah, I mean the main the way I've been thinking about it primarily is that the humans and humanoid entities are something like pets or something like children on a playground, and the minds with the capital M, the AI, are the adults, and that's broadly speaking an analogous kind of relationship. And so occasionally there are disagreements among the adults, and occasionally the adults of the culture come into genuine conflict with other adults in the universe. But as far as the humans go, we're children or pets or something like that. And there's some drama and some interest on the playground and some intrigue. But, we don't really shape the course of events at all any more than children shape the course of human affairs, right? It's the adults that do that. So it's like that.
Yeah, so let's put this in touch with Buterin's essay. So Buterin's essay, which was titled D/AC, as a reference to E/AC, effective accelerationism. We've talked about EAC before. I maybe won't rehash what it means. The name is pretty self-explanatory, I think, as a response to effective altruism, perhaps, I think, in terms of the naming. So there's a developing or already flowering antagonism between effective accelerationism and effective altruism, the latter being somewhat conflated with like AI safety, which is a sort of important cause area for effective altruism these days. Just sort of around, I mean, to put it on a very narrow axis, which is the way that the effective accelerationists would frame it, basically around if you have to choose between acceleration and deceleration, going forward with technology or going backwards, choose going forward, build, don't whinge, etc., etc. Okay, so Buterin, who of course is the founder of Ethereum and sort of widely respected in the tech ecosystem as both a thinker and a doer, penned an essay. He has many good essays on the topic of techno-optimism, so basically just laying out that while he agrees with the general spirit of technology being good and needing to move forward, most, or many, I think we can say most in the Disruption Seminar, most of the good things that we take for granted in the modern world, maybe not entirely due to technology, but in large part are either made possible by or sort of brought to fruition by the application of technology. So more is better by default. Obviously not all technology, infinitely widely distributed, will be good. Biotech comes to mind. But by default we should be positive about it. However, he acknowledges in the essay that inventing superintelligence is not a generic technological event, and maybe, along with biotechnology, one of the things about which we should be more cautious, and tries to thread the needle there on being positive and optimistic about technology and wanting to focus on building things rather than just giving into the stagnation and typical human tendency to increase entropy and stop things from working by never doing anything new. So while pushing against that, acknowledges the risks and then tries to come up with some kind of sensible middle ground. I'll say personally, I think he fails to do that. I think the parts that he's reviewing, techno-optimism, which is his strength, are good and well written. But the parts on, like his thoughts on dealing with AI, basically strike me as like tissue thin or something. And he mentions the culture novels, and it's like the proximate cause of us talking about it. He mentions the culture novels in connection with, well, how do you imagine the future with superintelligence? What role do humans play in it? And if you imagine them as pets, are we okay with that? So putting aside the safety, just presuming the safety things work and everything is fine, and you end up in a future where humans coexist with superintelligent machines, what role do humans play in that future? Do you have any...
So can I just add one very quick thing, and this is to Iain Banks, the author of the Culture series, to his credit, and that is that, and I think he was very clever to do this. One reason why the Culture is a utopia and much less of a dystopia is because any human being, or any humanoid, in the Culture, inside the Culture, in that society, and I think even broader across the wider galaxy, can escape at any time. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of funny. It's like I don't know if you guys have seen that old movie Beetlejuice, but so you can literally ascend out of physical reality to something like heaven through a process called subliming, and anybody can do that at any moment by basically shouting into the air, I sublime, I sublime, I sublime. And then that's it. You start the process, and up you go. And I'm not kidding. This is part of the
Really?
the setting. Yeah, subliming is absolutely, it's a critical part of several of the stories.
But humans can do that? I thought that was a minds thing.
Yes, and it's no, any of the, at least to my understanding, any entity that's participating in a society that that has reached a certain level of technological capability, in other words, basically the level of the Culture, there is a self-evident pathway out of the universe that eventually most conscious beings just choose to take, because there's much more. I forget how he characterizes, but there's vastly more degrees of freedom and infinite fun or something like that that's available. in the quote unquote in the sublime, and when if only very, 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 very rarely do entities that have sublimed come back, and their reports of it are very, anyway, it's kind of a convoluted thing, but it's a conceit in the storytelling, and I think, to my judgment, the entire reason why that conceit is there is to avoid the assumption that would very quickly follow, which is that, geez, all these humanoids are there, but they're trapped in this authoritarian system and they can't escape. And so wouldn't it be horrible to, on some level, to, as nice as the life of a pet is, or as nice as life as a child on the playground might be, if you're capped, if your advancement and your development is curtailed, then you're a prisoner. You're not free, no matter how nice the prison is. It's still a gilded cage. And I think he put this escape clause, quite literally, not just figuratively, but a literal escape clause into the universe to avoid that kind of preconception that people would bring into every story. And so as it is, nobody's stuck, that you can just escape. And so what ends up happening is, at least in the conceit is Iain Banks says most people choose to live about 300 years, and then they've had enough of life as a human being, enough living on the playground, enough being a pet, and then they transcend out. And those that transcend are well beyond the minds and their capabilities, and those are sublime upwards. So anyway, that's relevant again to kind of to Iain Banks' credit, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. So the infinite playground of fun features in the Accession, but that's sort of presented as what minds think is actually interesting, right? So the
I'm confusing the two of those things. Yeah, I'm confusing.
Yeah,
the two
so
of those things. You're right. That's a playground for the minds. That's right. That's not subliming. Subliming is something different.
Yeah. All right. So the D in DAC stands either for defense, decentralization, democracy, or differential. I don't think we necessarily need to go into all those. But one topic that is touched on in the essay is the contrast, which occurs to anybody, I think, who thinks about this topic, between centralization and decentralization of these capabilities, which we've discussed many times. Centralization having several benefits, one of which potentially is safety, given that the argument that many on the cutting edge would make for the reason why they should be the ones who get to develop AGI is that they are responsible, and therefore it's better for them to get there first. Of course, the people who are not on the frontier would tend to disagree that somebody else should get all the power. So decentralization is also a natural way forward, has arguments for it. It's not clear necessarily that the centralized model is in fact safer. The NSA would also claim that centralizing control over communication networks has many safety benefits, but maybe China would disagree, and Snowden would disagree also, and maybe so would I. So the arguments for centralization as enabling safety have many holes in them. The argument for decentralization, empowering everybody to defend themselves as a route to safety, also has many profound holes. I don't think Buterin really offers anything there, but on the side of decentralization, the obvious sort of forecast there is that if you have many superintelligent entities around, even if they are relatively safe, well, in order for that to be made safe for people, there's an issue of oversight, and it naturally occurs to people that maybe if you just sort of uploaded humans or augmented humans, they would be more capable of performing that oversight. And so the sort of idea of brain-computer interfaces or transhumanism naturally arises as you think about how to make the planet safe for humans with the advent of superintelligence. So, yeah, it's sort of like a hidden... I mean, I don't think transhumanism is meant to be the topic of the essay, but it's sort of latent in many of these discussions that temperamentally, if you prefer decentralization and you want to widely distribute access to this technology, I think I'm just sort of raising the question of whether this like logically implies that you are gung-ho about basically forcing people, or like a world where that works. Is that only a world in which many people are augmented themselves in order to keep up? So I feel like this essay is a bit of a I'm just sort of, I guess we've talked a bit about transhumanism, and it's an emerging worldview, ideology that maybe stands both behind effective altruism and effective accelerationism and DAC. So I'm just sort of curious, trying to think through like how this transhumanist ethos continues to come to the forefront, and in what forms.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on the sequencing of events, and so you have several key milestones in technological advancement, and which order they occur in really, I think, makes an enormous difference. I think we see very different worlds emerging depending on the order that we achieve these. So the ones I'm thinking of are artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, and a mature brain-computer interface that allows for human cognitive enhancement via connecting to digital resources. And I think it's still difficult to say what the timeline of those is. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I might have guessed we were closer to brain-computer interface than AGI and ASI. Now, I think my view is reversed on that. I think it now looks like AGI is likely, very likely, to be the first of those three to arise. It may be that a mature brain-computer interface is not possible until after. In other words, we may need the help of AGI to get it working on any reasonable timescale. And it might be 50 years without the assistance of artificial general intelligence, for example. I'm still sort of on the fence. I've seen compelling arguments both for and against the FOOM argument that a SI arises very rapidly after a GI. Again, that's the if you'd asked me 5 or 10 years ago, I was pretty strongly in the FOOM camp. It seemed quite reasonable to me that fully general intelligence would self-improve and result in its intelligence explosion quite rapidly. But as we see more and more capable systems emerging, I'm now more sanguine about that, and more receptive to arguments that there won't be a hard takeoff. So Sam Altman, I think, is the kind of a voice in that camp. The idea that AGI is not that far away, but it will be longer than many expect to reach sort of strong superintelligence. And I'm more sympathetic to that than I once was. And the main reason why, I don't know if you guys are experiencing this, is that we're the non-general artificial intelligences we have, so the AI we have today, is very broadly capable across many domains, and yet, sort of, and I mean, from the perspective of 10 years ago, ChatGPT running on GPT-4 could almost pass the Turing test, or come very close to, by the standards of the past 10 or 20 years ago, and yet, despite being able to do that, it seems like it still has some clear limitations that prevent it from being fully general. And so, and now that nut could crack any moment, I suppose, or maybe even already has been, if conspiracies are to be believed. But I'm open to the idea that it could be a softer takeoff rather than a harder takeoff for a variety of different reasons. So again, all of this is just preface to say that the order in which these things arise leads to very different. And the sequencing, I should say, these things arise leads to a very different world. If AGI arises first, which it now looks like, and then it's it is a FOOM situation and we have artificial superintelligence very quickly, and brain-computer interfaces are something that happen later, then that's a very different world than one in which brain-computer interfaces happen first. We get transhumanism, we get cybernetic superintelligence, and then AGI, lags that by 10 years. That's a very different world. And so I think if we want to talk through these, we need to decide which of, we could set out, one or two different sequences as scenarios and then talk through each of those. But just to start off with, I do think we need to be clear picking one, because the outcomes are so different, at least to my judgment.
So what is the essential criteria by which you decide whether something is transhuman or not? Like, presumably augmenting your intelligence with a phone in your hand and GPT running on the phone is not transhuman. Sticking the same capability inside your skull, maybe, obviously is transhuman or something. What is the criteria by which we sort of decide that a given pathway for human development is transhuman?
Well, if you ask a old school transhumanist like me, we already are transhumanists. We already are transhuman, and that's but it's an important point to take on board, because then the future developments seem less like radical departures and more like a continuation along a trajectory that we're already quite advanced along the way on. And this you can push quite far back into human history, and you can also point to the feared future consequences being not in the future, but already with us and had been with us for quite a while. So what I mean by that is the consequences that you fear of inequality on the basis of ability, for example. Those don't just lie in the future with transhumanism. Anybody alive today who has an education, who's literate, in a Western society, for example, somebody who's fully literate is absolutely transhuman compared to an illiterate human being from 5, 10, 50,000 years ago. You are vastly, vastly more capable by virtue of having had an education. And that can be just the tooling, like the ability to speak and articulate your thoughts and write. Just that, even if you had very little knowledge. But then I add on top of that the general knowledge that an educated person has as well, and you have a staggeringly enormous advantage over someone who does not have an education, and that's absolutely the empowerment through a form of practical knowledge. So it would absolutely qualify as a technology in my world.
Okay.
In my viewpoint.
But when I vote for
we're already. My point is, we're already there. We already have this, and we already have a very unequal world where people who do have an education have enormous advantages, and they're totally overwhelming versus people who don't. And so we already live in that world where the outcomes are determined by capability, and we live in a world that's dystopianly meritocratic. We already live in that world. So, and there are quite strong debates about this. Like, should you award on the basis of merit? Should people who work hard and succeed be rewarded? I mean, on what basis should we reward people? And merit is often invoked, but that's a totally unfair basis to reward people, because capability is grossly inequitably distributed. Absolutely terribly unfairly distributed, and so transhumanism of the future would only be an extension of what we already have now, right? And then you could argue to the contrary that you could conceive of transhumanist outcomes that equalize rather than widen the polarization of capability, in the same way that some tools in technologies historically have been great equalizers, and probably the most famous example of this is the revolver or the handgun, the pistol, and up until the advent of the pistol and it becoming relatively affordable and available, people who were physically large and strong and skillful warriors basically had enormous advantages physically over everybody else, and then as soon as we invented pistols, that advantage evaporated, just gone. Anybody can hold a gun and pull the trigger, and that's a massive equalizer. And quite rightly, or not quite rightly, but quite expectedly, that technology exerted an absolutely transformative impact on human civilization. Just totally different worlds. The world after the firearms, especially handheld firearms, as opposed to muskets, cannons, that sort of thing, and the world before, the world of axes and swords and that sort of thing, bows and arrows. So we've already seen this, and so I don't know. I wouldn't. I could construct scenarios either way, where future transhumanist technology, especially cognitive enhancement, you could argue that it could widen the gap between sort of the cognitive haves and have-nots, or you could also construct scenarios where that gap narrows if the technology can be deployed widely enough.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And so we could talk through both of those.
Some of the early studies on impacts of augmentation with things like GPT in the workplace suggest that the highest performing people benefit a bit, but the major effect is that people at or below the median get dragged up to the median or a little bit higher, so that there is some evidence, I think, statistically for this compression effect, at least from the current tools. Which it does make a lot of sense to me, right? I mean, given the current capabilities of the tools, it's not going to probably lead you to make a revolutionary new idea, but it will assist somebody who struggles with a task at performing at kind of average level. It's very easy to see how that would work and work at great scale. So I'm not sure that will last very long, but I think at least at the moment I could see that as being a major effect over the next couple of years. Yeah.
I mean, if I wind the clock back 15 years and I imagine my own personal timeline looking ahead, my thinking was artificial general intelligence is maybe 50 years away, brain-computer interfaces are maybe 25 or 30 years away, and if they arise first and there's a gap between the two, then you would have a world without super intelligent AI, but with super intelligent individual human beings. And in a world like that, then the question is, who controls compute resources? It's still that. I mean, that's a big question in general for any of these scenarios, of course. But if you were to, let's start with small numbers. If 100 people have a working brain-computer interface, and they want access to compute in the cloud because they're sort of, their exocortex, the part of their new cortex that's outside their body, is going to need to run on some computing substrate, and that computing substrate would look like data centers that we have now, at least initially, I suppose. Then it would be a matter of, well, who can access the most compute, and how do we determine what the right to access that is? And from there, you can imagine, what if it was 1,000 or 10,000 or 1 million or 1 billion people with these interfaces, and how would we share the compute? How would compute be distributed? On what basis? Is it, and then that's an open question, and it would be interesting to see who decides that and how that's decided. And one could imagine a spectrum from very grossly inequitable arrangements and mechanisms for determining that access, and to much more equitable ones, right? You could say, well, in the same way that we think about wealth, right? I mean, wealth is maybe a quite an analogous thing. And today we don't place upper limits on wealth, and we do a very modest pittance of wealth redistribution and income redistribution, but not that much. And so we have just massive gap between the wealthiest and the poorest people. And if we had that sort of situation with brain-computer interfaces and access to compute, then the wealthiest people who could afford to buy entire data centers just for their own brain would presumably retain an insurmountable advantage over others. If it were possible somehow to make a different collective decision about the distribution of compute resources, it could be that hard caps on how much an individual could own or of compute or have a right to access. You could place a limit so nobody can have more than a certain amount, and then you could place a floor there too and say, well, we're going to grant everybody at least this much. And those would be very, very different outcomes. I think one's probably a little more naive and hopeful and optimistic than the other. you can imagine it going both ways, or somewhere in the middle of that continuum.
Well, ChatGPT is free.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is the thing: is it's surprising. This is, for some of these technologies, they're surprisingly democratically available at a very early stage. This is despite no shortage of cynical hot takes on all new technology. Oh, well, just it's only going to be available for a few billionaires, for the either indefinitely or for the first number of years until those individuals secure a totally insurmountable head start and advantage over everybody else. But something like ChatGPT and the internet and other digital technologies, run contrary to that. They become very cheap and available very broadly very early on, one could argue that it's a little bit different with cognitive enhancement if it's open-ended, how much progress you can make, and what in other words, what the returns to investment are there. Like if there continue to be great returns as you expand, the compute that you have access to mentally, well then there'd be a lot of incentive for the Bill Gateses of the world and the Elon Musks of the world to purchase entire data centers that none of the rest of us could afford, and then they could be smarter than any of the rest of us could hope to be. But on the other hand, maybe there are some limits there. I mean, Bill Gates' smartphone's no better than anybody else's, despite the fact that he could buy 1 million of them with his change in his couch. So it's difficult to know. My intuition is to be cautious because I think probably there are a lot of returns to be had there for greater compute. But again, as I said, this is all presuming the older, and now in my opinion much less likely scenario that we don't have AGI and ASI first. And it's to my eyes that's looking increasingly improbable. That it's the transhumanist cognitive enhancement of the science fiction kind via brain-computer interface is to my eye now looks almost certain to happen, to arise after AGI and not before. I don't know if you have a different take on that, Dan, but that's my take certainly at the moment.
That seems, I think it would be very hard to argue otherwise currently, at least based on my understanding of both technologies, which is quite shallow in the case of brain-computer interfaces, but having read some of the primary literature there, obviously it's making rapid progress, partly on the back of progress in deep learning, you have to say, without which, as far as I understand it, the current frontier wouldn't really be possible. But I find it a bit far-fetched to imagine brain-computer interfaces being radically useful within the time frame on which I expect AGI to arrive. So to put this back in the context of Buterin's essay, so he's sort of mentioning this as one potential pathway towards humans being in the future with superintelligence but not being pets. That presuming that humans that are augmented or uploaded or whatever remain human in some reasonable sense. I think we deeply disagree about that. I think being human is a much more fragile thing than that, and that is like a human-flavored superintelligence rather than a human in some like the deep level. So I'm not actually sure that really is on my terms a resolution to the problem of humans being pets in the future, and I just honestly don't know what to think about that. I guess I'm just resigned to being a pet as maybe the upper bound of what is reasonably achievable, although that doesn't strike me as optimistic as I would like to be or something.
What is an even if it were unlikely, what would a more optimistic outcome be in your mind?
Yeah, I'm honestly very confused about that. I guess the picture you would like to paint of a optimistic future for humanity might be something like, spreading to the stars and achieving all sorts of amazing technology and living a long time and this huge advanced civilization. I'm not saying that's my dream, but that's like one dream that people reasonably reach for. And then to achieve that, it's quite natural to reach for greater capabilities of intelligence and so on, and to want to move faster. I guess the difference between teenage Daniel and 40-year-old Daniel is that I kind of imagine that stops being a human civilization almost tautologically at some point, and that therefore it no longer has the attraction or something, right? I guess I'm torn between that as being temperamentally kind of feeling cool, and the idea of like humanity retiring on Earth and it's a paradise and we're just still meat bags, but we have children and we take care of them, and there's no poverty and we're just happy, but basically as we are, which would have seemed to teenage Daniel like milk toast, kind of like lame, unambitious, kind of pathetic. Now that I have a child, no longer seems that pathetic to me, but I sort of temperamentally still find that not completely satisfactory or something. So I feel like that is a fine future, and it's already like a lot of work to achieve that and to defend that against destabilizing things like superintelligence. But I can't either really put that forward as a strong vision towards which we must all work very hard or something, if you know what I mean. So I feel somewhat confused about what I think an optimistic future is, torn along those axes.
That seems to sort of presume that we have. It sort of seems to presume a zero-sum kind of. You have to choose one or the other, as opposed to you can have your cake and eat it too. All of these options are available, and in my mind, the maximization of choice is and available options to explore is sort of the in the meta-analysis, that's the meta scenario that you want. You want all of the possible scenarios that people might elect to be viable choices, rather than having to pick one and accept whatever suboptimal attributes it has, and try, compared to all of the other individual scenarios and their various suboptimal aspects. I had when I was teaching at UCLA, when I was teaching environmental courses, this would come up because it's fairly, you run into this question fairly quickly environmentally, which is what kind of world ought we be aspiring towards? When people invoke notions of environmental sustainability, you have to ask immediately the question: sustain what? What would a sustainable world look like? And you have to choose. And it's tough, right? I mean, and when I used to get classrooms full of students arguing about this, they'd make a case for different scenarios. They'd say, well, when one group, and sometimes I'd assign different, if they were having trouble thinking of themselves, I'd assign, okay, you guys defend this case and you guys defend this case and so on, and then get people, construct a debate that way. And it would be like, okay, so what ecological state should we aspire for a given landscape to be? So should we just leave the landscape alone and let it recover on its own, free from human action? Should we restore a landscape to a previous ecological state? But then if you have the capability to do that, what state? Like this pre-industrial state, or the pre-Columbian state, if you're in North America, like what the continent was like before colonial Europeans arrived, or the post-Ice Age state, or the mid-Ice Age state? Where I'm sitting right now, 10,000 years ago, there were 2 miles of ice overhead. Is that the right? Is that natural? Is that what we ought to restore the natural world to? What is the right condition? And it was funny because you've got the kids arguing about this undergraduate students, get them arguing about this long enough. It's like that scene from the movie War Games, what you finally realize is that you need a transcendent solution. That there is no winning any of the argument for or against any one of these cases. What the kids always would arrive at is, we have to have all those choices available, and we have to kind of figure out some fairly reasonable way to divide the world up so that some of it is prehistoric and some of it's pre-industrial and some of it's glacial and blah blah blah, and that the real world you want is one with all of those options, all of the above, in some measure. And so when I think about, what is the, to look at the scenarios you talked about, I want both of those and more. I want the option to live a bucolic, primitive, more primitivist life. I want the option to live, sort of a 21st century, early 21st century urban existence. That's kind of cool. I want the option to, go out into space, but still as human beings and with that, taming the wild frontier kind of that pioneer sort of thing, but with some of that excitement in it. And then I want the full on, I want to, merge with the hive mind, and upload and become part of the collective superintelligence. I want all of those. And I want all of those to be options. And not only that, more than just that, I don't want to have all of those options to choose from. I want to choose all of them simultaneously and have access to all of those. And then, periodically regroup and share experiences, meld into one consciousness again, and then splinter off and shatter again and go away for a century and have different experiences and then reunite and reunify and share all of that again. And so I'm a very much pluralist and sort of have your cake and eat it too, all of the above kind of scenario there.
Yeah, I have a couple.
And I have to say that's my the position I'm sort of explaining, very widespread in the transhumanist community.
Yeah, I have a couple of responses to that. The first being, I think, that maximizing freedom of choice, or maybe actively increasing it, is, I don't think, consistent with being a very specific kind of being. So we are a very specific organism. If you think about the evolutionary tree, we're at some particular leaf. You can, of course, increase the degrees of freedom by climbing back up that tree, whether at the level of a species or at the level of your individual cells in your body. I mean, pluripotent goo is maximizing degrees of freedom in a certain sense, especially if it's very capable goo. But that is, like, in some sense, I think intrinsically, it depends what you mean by humanity, right? So, the pathway you're sketching out seems like a convergent endpoint for many different species that maybe are indistinguishable from each other once you go far enough along that path, right? What is human about that? I think, like, I would disagree that you get to use the label human for some parts of your panoply. Some parts of it sort of remain rather human. Some parts, in fact, I think are not human at all, except in some, like, the soup is flavored with human bits. So I don't think you're sketching actually like a panoply of human continuation. It's human extinction in some parts, in effect, by my terms, and human continuation in other parts. So I think if I take a cynical view of the panoply you've just outlined, it's in fact the allowance of the emergence of competitors in the galaxy to humans, which maybe have some humanish bits, but I don't really see an intrinsic reason why I should be excited about those, like, things that remember humanity dimly before they became galaxy-spanning, giga-brained things. Why should I think of that as necessarily human?
Oh, I don't think it needs to be human. Post-human is the other term that goes alongside transhuman, right? So post meaning after or beyond. But again, I don't think that I don't see the loss in
as long as the
additional
other human stuff is still
as long as the human stuff is still there, and as long as it remains an option, an accessible option. So for example, in the same way that you and I can sort of conjure and role play a character in our mind that isn't us, but has, some attributes of intelligence because we're imbuing it with intelligence, right? I mean, you can role play a character, you can construct a figment of your imagination. I could imagine post-human superintelligence of various kinds, fully artificial or some other evolutionary path to superintelligence, whether originally human or not, or in some admixture. But I can imagine fully fledged humans being figments of artificial superintelligence or just human superintelligence in the future. And in the same way that you can you can imagine a character, and that character can be pretty rich and lively. A full human existence could be a figment of a superintelligence imagination, and even if it's just that is I can easily see coexistence of what you could argue, or what I would perceive as inarguably human still, and things that are very much either, depending on how you look at it, not human or more than human in the future. And I just don't see a necessarily destructive coexistence there. And if obviously you can think of scenarios where the heartlessly efficient superintelligence does not care at all about anything else that's come before it, or the biosphere or anything like that. It doesn't matter that the biosphere is categorically the most interesting observable thing in the universe right now, that it would just wipe it out and turn it into more computronium for whatever its goals are. I can sustain those sorts of possible outcomes, which are terrible.
Yeah.
But I'm much more inclined to think that superintelligences could find a way to exist and leave humans existing as well, and that there may well be fluid ways to transit between those two modes of being for any given consciousness. And that, I think, is quite an exciting and interesting, I don't know how likely, but quite an exciting and interesting possibility. And the other thing, the last thing, just very quickly to add, Dan, is that I think I'm probably less attached to what makes human beings, what is essentially human. I'm less attached to sort of the physical and the evolved traits and qualities and attributions, and more attached to the human conscious experience, or something we would recognize as conscious experience. And I think that could, and one reason why I'm interested in that is I suspect that conscious experience varies more from one person today, one human being to another, than we appreciate. And so I think they're quite radically different conscious experiences that individuals already have. And so just adding to the diversity of conscious experience is, I don't think, inherently destructive.
Interesting. I'm going to read out Matt's comments on this. Matt, you want to say them out loud? Then I'll read them. Matt says, I think human descendants may not need to be human to be worthy descendants, in the same way that your child is not the same as you. And he also says, I think options are not the same, or not worth the same as choices. So I'm worried there's some fundamental contradiction in wanting everything possible. Yeah, I guess I think of human descendants as... Oh, you can add to that if you think there's more to add, Matt, before I respond.
That's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. I guess it's a failure mode of people to want to shape their children to be exactly like them as a form of immortality, or maybe not. Maybe you're not aiming directly at that, but you value certain things so highly that you sort of aim to make those values be represented in the place where you can have an impact on what values get represented, whether that's your child or some other system. And yeah, maybe that's it's part of being mature to not focus too much on that. But I think humans are all within an epsilon or something in some grander scheme of things. So wanting your child to not be the same as you, I mean, feels to me like it's kind of like a trivial difference compared to the difference between me and what I imagine something super intelligent to be, whether it's conscious or not. Like, yeah, I think there's like a key. This is one of the things that people often critique EAC for, right? As and maybe I think there's a sense in which right now, given that we are only familiar with our own consciousness and perhaps the consciousness of other creatures we share the planet with, but let's put those aside for now. Maybe that's not a valid move, but we tend to conflate consciousness with human consciousness and therefore imagine that more consciousness, or like we will value a world in which there's lots more consciousness, and we don't think of that as being such a different set of values from valuing a future in which humans flourish. But I think what the political debate around EAC and transhumanism and some of the people in AI and their visions for the future, like Rich Sutton and Schmidhuber, seems to me this is a huge chasm, like an absolutely enormous chasm that pits one group of humans completely diabolically against another group of humans. Like, valuing consciousness per se and valuing human consciousness, I think, may be irreconcilable, like war-driving differences. I'm just interested in, and I'm not, like, I don't know where that line is, and I feel like when you go down the path you're sketching, Adam, that at least many parts of it are not human consciousness, and you're okay with that. I find it, I'm not sure I'm not okay with it, but it seems extremely problematic and dangerous to me in a way that doesn't seem to strike you as worth being afraid of. Okay, I have defeated Adam. His arguments are exhausted, and he quit. While we wait, oh, there he is. He's back. For round 2, the transhumanists have been defeated, their arguments refuted, left in shame, and now having returned. On your knees, Adam. What do you have to say? Did you hear what I said? No. Hello again, Adam.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear most of that. This is just as soon as I start to mount my defense, I get booted out of the system. Well, if there's ever a sign of a bad omen, well, I mean, fundamentally, I don't accept the premise that coexistence is not possible, and that, or rather, peaceful and constructive coexistence is impossible. For example, I just reject the premise outright that a future where we have a multiplicity of intelligences and consciousnesses beyond human beings that are our descendants, whether fully artificial or hybrid or something, that necessarily implies that there must be fewer human consciousnesses. In fact, I think it's almost certainly the opposite. That if it were not for AGI, ASI, and other superintelligence arising on a given time scale, just say the next 5,000 years, the number of human consciousnesses would be vastly lower. Because, for example, we wouldn't be constructing, Halo-style orbitals with a trillion human inhabitants on them, or the option for a trillion human inhabitants on them. And so the number, and not to say nothing of the quality. Quality meaning, more flourishing and well-being and joy and less suffering. I think that a condition of multiplicity means more of everything. In other words, a growing pie means more of every slice is larger as well. And if you want to think of it that way, or you can pick some other metaphor. So I just don't accept as a as a presumption that more of one means less of the other. It's just zero-sum thinking that I think is
Okay,
quite easily disputed. Now, that's not to say you can't construct a scenario where humanity gets wiped out, or there are only a few hundred of us left living in caves, and that's awful. I'm sure the Terminator scenario is one that's worth being wary of. But I don't think that is the only one or even the most likely scenario. I think a much more likely scenario is a pluralistic and multiplicitous one, and where there's more humanity, not less, a more traditional baseline humanity, not less. The other thing I would point out is I see. I'll try to articulate it. I'm not very good at articulating this yet, I don't think, but I see sort of some kind of logical error. I don't know exactly how to characterize it, but maybe you can help you guys. But this is the distinction between possible persons or possible minds or beings versus the ones that exist. And you see this in of all unlikely places. You see this in the confusion in the abortion debate. So this idea, abortion is wrong.
Careful
and so
with
forth.
Roblox
But
voice chat now.
Oh yes, okay, sorry, yes. So I'll use the A word
Yes,
from now on for that. But in the context of that debate, there's often this thinking. Well, you would be perfectly happy. Like somehow there's a false equivocation, a false equivalence drawn between a consciousness that exists and a consciousness that is still only potential. And the nature of that error is that, say for example, you were going to bring a new life into the world. It isn't a choice between the choice of the A word before and after that person exists is fundamentally different, and I'll try to put my finger on what I mean. The reason why, and I don't see this in much of the debate at all, and that is that before a person exists, there is only the possibility of a person existing, and that possibility, the possible person that might exist, is one among a virtually infinite number of possible persons. So it's like before you pull the marble out of the urn, or the marble, or the grain of sand off the beach. There's an enormous number of possible persons that could come into existence, and they don't exist yet. That's totally different before the fact of someone actually existing, because once they exist, then of course you would never remove their existence. That's a crime. That's absolutely appalling. That's terrible. But that's because they already exist. And of all of the possible persons that might exist, they are the one that actually does, as a matter of fact. And so there's when I see the utilitarian logic of, well, we ought to maximize the number of future consciousnesses, and therefore, if having 10 trillion minds, 100 years from now, if the only way to get that is by murdering all 8 billion human minds today, well, that's terrible. It's insane. That's totally crazy. But if you don't see this error about the distinction between existing versus merely potential minds from a virtually infinite number of potential ones, then you miss something fundamental there. And I'm struggling to put my finger on it, but there's an equivalence that people draw, sort of like an actuarial or an accounting kind of equivalence between minds that exist and minds that only have the potential to exist, and those are not equivalent. And the reason why they're not equivalent is because the number of potential minds that could exist is infinite, or effectively infinite. It's so large that it might as well be infinite. And the minds that already do exist are priceless, precisely because they are such a tiny, 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 tiny realized fraction of the minds that could exist. Maybe I'm failing utterly to convey what I'm thinking there, but I have a very strong feeling, a very strong intuition that this is a crucially pivotal notion or idea or concept, and I just don't encounter that in the logic when I read through, for example, the accelerationist or sort of first order simplistic consequentialist and utilitarian thinking. Make of that what you will.
I think I understand what you're saying. I want to maybe push back on the word descendant being used too easily. So I think, just to check, I think this is correct, but I think everything you said earlier remains something you believe in if I remove the word descendant, right? So if some transhuman, digitally augmented or purely digital thing that maybe has human aspects, if that is not in fact a descendant in any real sense, but is its own separate thing, conscious, let's say, then what you were saying earlier remains true, right? It's not critical for you that it be in some deep sense a descendant of human beings. I mean, obviously that term has...
I think that literal biological descendant is... I'm willing to be a little cavalier in, or at least loose in what I categorize as a descendant. I would be inclusive in that respect and categorize artificial intelligence that arises on Earth as humanity's descendants. For example, if we were to encounter extraterrestrial intelligence, I would definitely categorize that as other in a way that I would not categorize our own AI descendants as other. And so in other words, I would not equivocate alien intelligence with human descended artificial intelligence. If one would definitely have more historical roots and attachment and accoutrement and heritage, even if it was quite, in practical terms, alien. It would still be part of Earth's unique developmental and evolutionary heritage in a way that a properly extraterrestrial civilization and its intelligence wouldn't be. And so I would definitely have be of a preferential mind there for that reason. I think, in other words, I think there is absolutely some value to continuity with history and antecedent, even if it's not like a literal biological descendancy.
Is Pythagoras' theorem a descendant?
Yeah, I mean, well, then you get to whether or not things are discovered versus created, and I don't have a strong philosophical stance on that because I haven't dug through it enough.
Think we disagree very strongly.
I see where you're
point.
pushing there. Yeah, that's tough, right? But you could if you're being mechanistic and materialist determinist about things, you could argue the same for the mechanisms and the atoms of your children. I mean, they're in some sense just billiard balls knocking around too. But the sum is more than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right?
Adam says, okay, well, if the AIs aren't descendants, then your children aren't descendants either. Well, yeah, I think we disagree about this. I think there's really
well, no, I don't. I'm not. I don't object to there being some sort of gradation there, and I would probably have different feelings towards a cybernetically originated superintelligence that eventually evolved off of biological substrate versus a de novo AI that were coded up from the bottom up in silico. I think there is some difference there. There's one could certainly argue for more continuity in the web of life with the former than with the latter. But having said that, it's matters of degree.
Okay.
I don't think I see hard cutoffs there.
So suppose that the algorithm for AGI fits on a page, and it is invented and trained, and then it isn't necessarily trained like an LLM on lots of human data. It's more like the deep RL systems that sort of bootstraps off its environment and therefore learns about people, but fundamentally the algorithm and its sort of core loop is just this simple kind of mathematical fact. And it arrives on Earth, so to speak, and you are convinced it's a descendant, but then it's revealed that this one page was actually received by a radio telescope as our first communication from aliens. Is it a descendant?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fun scenario. But you could spin it around and say, imagine you received as a file the 3 billion digit DNA code, and you were under the impression this was the genome of your offspring, and you decided to through a technological process, clone that offspring in the laboratory rather than in vitro, and you produce, you wholly construct life. You take some bare scaffolding of cellular structure and put in the DNA and the other organelles in the nucleus, and then you do all this in vivo, and then you implant this into a fertilized egg, and then a human mother carries this, surrogate carries this through fetal development, embryonic development, gives birth. This is a human being, and then you find out at the very end of it that you received that DNA, that 3 gigabyte file from your radio telescope. Is it your descendant? I mean, you get that. This is we're all just information. We're all just data. We're all just bits and bytes, and whether they're in, exactly how they're encoded in atoms, and the lineage of those specific patterns is where the magic is. I mean, it's in the patterns and in the data and in their connection to history. So, but in my mind, it is not the difference in type that matters so much. It's the I don't object to that. So you can probably bowl me over with or agree to disagree. I think that regardless of their lineage, we should probably think of all intelligent persons, intelligent minds as reasonably connected through the lineage to the all of life on Earth and its history, and then also humanity. But where I would be much more concerned, and where I really do, I think, part ways quite profoundly with the EAC folks, is equivocating future possible persons with people today, and being willing to do some sort of discounting analysis and discount the value of present human beings for the sake of possible entities in the future. This, I think, is very dangerous insanity, and quite frankly, I don't care how big the numbers are. And you get into, is it okay to murder Hitler to save 10 billion people kind of territory?
I don't actually understand
but
how
you could say, well, is it okay to murder all human beings today to for the sake of a quadrillion potential human beings tomorrow, or 100 years or 1,000 or 10,000 years in the future? My answer will almost always be no. It's never okay to sacrifice the present for the future, because you cannot know enough about the future to ever make that calculus.
Yeah, I guess I don't really understand exactly how that's connected to the other topic for you. Maybe I'll say one thing before you answer that, though, which is, I sort of grant the comeback, but I think there's like a difference in quantity becoming a difference in kind at some point there. So I would say that evolution, having acted through gradual changes for billions of years, it's sort of legitimate to view that data, whether or not you want to reconstruct my child from a file or not. That data is sort of like part of a process that is quite continuous, whereas the weights of GPT-10 on a hard drive, like, I don't actually see that as a continuation in any meaningful sense. I sort of get why you think so, but no offense, but I think it's like a superficial similarity compared to the similarity between biological descendants. Now you could say that, I would agree that my biological descendant, I sort of think of them as a descendant partly because they acquire a very similar culture, and that's stuff that is ingested once they're born, that if they were to just grow up with wolves or something, then maybe in some sense it wouldn't really feel like my descendant, and that culture is something that a machine could also ingest. I grant all that, but I think I'm not going to sign up completely to the idea that, just because they're both files, that necessarily they're very similar things. It seems to me like, everything is information at some level, perhaps, but that doesn't I think, convince me of this point. But could you explain how the calculus about potential versus realized individuals, how that relates to the other thing in your mind? Oh, I can't hear you. I see a speech bubble above your head.
I also can't hear Adam, but I can hear him.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
I don't know why my microphone keeps. Maybe the microphone keeps dropping out. I don't know. Maybe Anyway, I'm having to. I logged out and back in, and that fixed it. But this time, I just went to the microphone settings, and that fixed it. So anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, I can hear you the whole time. So again, I get back to this very troubling element. The thing that's most troubling to me with the EAC, the effective accelerationism mindset, seems to be the idea that possible persons in the future that don't exist yet should have equal standing morally and ethically to persons who actually exist today, and that we ought, therefore, because there's no distinction morally and ethically between a person who might exist one day and a person who does exist today, that just on account of sheer numbers, we should take any action today that maximizes the number of future persons. And by maximizing future persons and their, potential to experience well-being and flourishing and positive conscious states, possibly much more positive than the ones we're capable of experiencing today, for example, and perhaps with much less suffering, then that could rationalize any conceivable action, no matter how horrific, today, including the extinction of everybody who lives today. This I find appalling, and I find it appalling for, again, to go back to the A-word logic I was trying to explain before, that there's something fun, and I can't quite put my finger on it, I don't think, but there's something that feels fundamentally flawed there about that equivocation, the idea that a potential person should have the same moral status as an existing person, and there's something deeply lost in the uncertainty there that I find extremely troubling and problematic. And so, but this logic looks different in the rearview mirror than it does prospectively. But we're only able to look at this prospectively. So, looking forward, I think that I would be very, very wary of making any bold or rash moves to accelerate, for example, the development of AGI and ASI, because the risks to people in the present are so great. And so I really part ways with the EAC folks, I think, in that, or the hardcore EAC folks in that respect. So that's what I meant by that, and I hope that makes some sense. Although I'm not able, I think, maybe I could put some time into mounting a better defense, but right now I'm not able to really put my finger on why I find that equivocating possible persons versus existing persons so disturbing and objectionable. I'm not able to really put my finger on why.
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand.
But yeah. I hope that makes sense.
Yep.
As for the lineage and the descendants and the connection, there's some sense in which that's perfectly fine and understandable. And I think there is an enormous there really is a lot to be said for continuity with deep time and deep history. And so I don't mean to belittle that at all, but I would juxtapose with that an argument alongside, which again, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that I think there's more diversity of mind today among human beings than we appreciate. I think and I certainly appreciate this much more now than I did before having children. So before having children, I was sort of content to thinking of, or not content, but I guess I realize now in retrospect that I was assuming most of human experience is very similar. So one person might have a very similar conscious experience to another person, human being, and that all humans are very, very similar. And I now, I think, have a much better basis for judging that to be a false assumption. And that's because my two children are so profoundly different from one another. So I have a profoundly gifted child who's 4 or 5 standard deviations above the norm on most metrics, and remarkable enough to be invited to special programs in the United States because of her gifts. And at the other end of the spectrum, I have a child with a genetic disorder that causes cognitive disability. And she's 5 standard deviations at least in the other direction. and there are massive differences in the minds and the lived experiences and the consciousness of my two children, and they're both direct descendants of me, and they're radically different minds. And I can easily see the differences between my two children's minds being larger than the difference between one of their minds and an artificial mind. I can easily see that being the case. So, with that in mind, with that in mind, no pun intended. With that as context, that's part of why I'm open to the idea that other very different minds from ours, including other animals, existing animals, ought to be granted a great deal of moral and ethical consideration, and that we ought to have the bounds of what qualifies as personhood be very expansive and inclusive, as broadly as possible. So that's where that's coming from.
Yeah. Good. I think that's a natural place to stop. It's 9:30 here. So thanks, Adam. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Ben.